Hello everyone, my name is Smit Desai, and today I'm going to be presenting metaphors in voice user interfaces, a slippery fish. So first of all, what are voice user interfaces? So voice interfaces are technologies that take voice as input and use voice as an output. So the examples include Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, as well as Siri, and they can be found in variety of devices like phones, computers, speakers, cars, and even microwaves, alarm clocks, fridges, etc. So it's safe to say that they are available everywhere. So while I was conducting a user study with a voice user interface, something really strange happened that inspired this paper. A participant was trying to play the song Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles with the help of Alexa. So they said, Alexa, play Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. And Alexa said, Sorry, I do not understand. So they said louder, Alexa, play Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. And Alexa said, Sorry, I don't understand. So they went closer to the device and said again loudly, Alexa, play Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. And Alexa said, Sorry, I don't understand. So I was in this room while this interaction was going on, and I was getting frustrated with how Alexa was responding. And I thought that the participant might be getting frustrated as well. However, this is when the strange thing happened. The participants started laughing and they said, It's funny. It's like talking to a silly child. So this was really interesting because their mental model of Alexa was that of a silly child. So now I wanted to uncover more mental models. So the next question is, how do we uncover the mental models of people interacting with voice user interfaces? Well, this is not quite simple because the human mind is like a black box. The internal mechanisms are invisible and can only be inferred based on input and output. However, like in our previous example, metaphors can help. So let's take a brief detour to understand what metaphors are. So in metaphors, there's a source domain and there's a target domain, and there's some kind of relationship between them. For example, life is like a journey. Here, the target domain is life, and life is made sense with the help of the metaphor of that of a journey. And that makes sense, right? Like life has it up and down, so it can be like a journey. Similarly, snow is covering the surface like blanket. Here, the visual property of snow seems like a blanket. Similarly, eyes are sparkling like stars, graphical user interfaces are like desktops, and large language models are like stochastic patterns. Over here, the similarity between the source domain and the target domain is quite obvious. So they are called similarity based metaphors. But what's far more interesting, at least for me, is similarity creating metaphors. So in Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? There's a familiar source domain, thee, and a familiar target domain, summer's day. But the relationship between the source domain and the target domain is not very clear. It only becomes clear when the relationship is explained. Over here, this explanation comes in the form of knowledge creation. For Shakespeare, the knowledge creation was poetry, but it can also result in science. However, the concept of metaphors in HCI is not new. There's a lot of history of using metaphors in HCI research. The most popular metaphor for graphical user interfaces is that of a desktop. So the desktop metaphor is the primary metaphor, and then it is decomposed into various secondary metaphors like menu, and also auxiliary metaphors like trash bin, scrolling, icons, etc. However, when we talk about voice user interfaces, we say that voice user interfaces are like humans. So humanness is used as the operational metaphor. But is this really true? Or is this even enough? So we decided to investigate whether humanness is an appropriate metaphor for voice user interfaces. And we asked ourselves the research question, what are the different metaphors people use for voice user interfaces, and what do these metaphors reveal about the perception of voice user interfaces? To answer this, first, we conducted a user study with 14 participants and asked them to perform some simple tasks with a smart speaker, and then we asked them about the experience of interacting with voice user interfaces. Then we analyzed the semi-structured interviews and identified metaphors used by the participants. It is important to note over here that at no point did we ask the participants to use metaphors. All use of metaphors were unprompted. We supplemented our user study with a literature review as well, which we did using the Prisma method, and we identified 80 articles from the ACM database, and we looked for metaphors in those 80 relevant articles. And we found lots of metaphors. In fact, we found about 220 metaphors used by our participants as well as other participants, designers, researchers, manufacturers, as well as users. And we grouped them together to understand how all of these stakeholders use metaphors to describe voice user interfaces. And we did find that all the categories of people used human metaphor, but the types of other metaphors used were fairly different. For example, designers provided metaphors like therapist or a coach or a teacher or a tutor to the participants, whereas researchers were also, like me, trying to uncover metaphors. So they would provide metaphors like a front desk or a family pet. Manufacturers use the assistant metaphors mainly. That makes sense. Google is an assistant. It's called Google Assistant. Alexa is also marketed as an assistant. And users made up their own metaphors based on the task that they were performing. So they would use metaphors like acquaintance, bad boyfriend, computer, or even a dictionary. Based on this, we developed a framework for metaphor contextualization in voice user interfaces. We looked for contextual dimensions that connected the use of each metaphor. We found that there were three main types of metaphors used. They were human metaphors, non-human, as well as metaphors from fiction, and they were mentioned by designers, manufacturers, researchers, as well as users. And they exploited knowledge of various things like human-human communication. So human voice user interface communication is based on human-human communication. And it also exploits the knowledge of request response mechanism. You ask your Alexa to do something and it does it for you. However, the motivation for using all these metaphors were quite different. Predominantly, it was for sense making. However, it could also be for understanding errors. For example, the silly child metaphor used in the earlier example was to make sense of an error. So people did use human metaphors to understand their interactions with voice user interfaces, but they also used non-human and fictional metaphors like robot, a genie, computer from Star Trek, a family dog, etc. For example, participant 3 over here says, it can understand me. They're talking about Alexa. It's like a dog. It's intelligent, but not that intelligent. So the intelligence of Alexa was compared to a dog for the purpose of sense making. We also found that not all metaphors were helpful. In fact, some were actually inappropriate. For example, the popular assistant metaphor is commonly used to describe voice user interfaces. However, being an assistant is sadly and unfortunately considered to be a woman's work, and voice user interfaces also use a default female voice. This could reinforce the same existing stereotypes that we have in society. Moreover, a human metaphor like a butler or a secretary could project more intelligence or trust than the VUI is actually capable of, leading to uncanny valley, illusion of intelligence, as well as miscalibration of trust. And most importantly, context matters a lot when people use metaphors. And people use metaphors based on the context of the conversation. For example, when they were giving a command like turn the lights off, they would use metaphors like butlers, genie, etc. When they were trying to have a social conversation with the voice user interface, like Alexa, tell me a joke, or play a game with me, they would use metaphors like a friend or an admirer. When they were trying to get some information from Alexa, they would use metaphors like librarian, search engine, etc. And when there was an error, where participants used all kinds of metaphors to make sense of the error, they would use very formal metaphors like I have to solve this error, like I'm talking to a computer, or they would go the opposite end and they would use a metaphor like a dog or a silly child. Moreover, we also found metaphor analysis to be a useful low fidelity technique to help with design as well as analysis. It can inspire creativity. For example, the genie metaphor. We can think about the genie metaphor and analyze the ways of making interactions with voice interfaces feel more magical. It can also provide common vocabulary to facilitate discussions with a variety of stakeholders, like the Big Brother metaphor that was frequently used in our analysis to make sense of the security risks associated with voice user interfaces. And it can also predict future problems that might happen. For example, the secretary or the assistant metaphor can have lots of uh, ethical consequences that we might have to look at in the future. So, with that, I would like to conclude this talk. Thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you very much.